Hello everyone, this is Piero Giorgio today in Cairo, Egypt. Wonderful. Wonderful ancient Egyptian work. Today we're going to talk about Egypt and the economic collapse. So for those who don't know me, my name is Piero Giorgio and I'm a Swiss author. My books are best-selling books about economic collapse and the future. I do videos whenever I can travel across the world. I've traveled in over 100 countries. Today I will talk about Egypt. Now Egypt, very, very old country, over 10,000 years old in terms of history, with of course great achievements in arts and culture, especially in the ancient Egypt, where, of course, in between the pyramids and the different temples, the life around the Nile River has been spectacular and one of the, if not the earliest civilization that we know of, with magnificent achievements and results. So great old land. Of course, Egypt has had economic collapses throughout its history. There was an economic collapse around 1000 before BC. And then, of course, Egypt had to suffer invasion from Persians, but also from Greeks, and later on, of course, Roman domination, and then Arab invasion. So Egypt knows a fair share about what it means to have foreigners on its soil, have economy going up and down. In fact, I should add the invasion of the French with Napoleon, the protectorate and occupation by the British, and of course the different wars of the 20th century. First of all, 1956, around the, I'm not counting World War II because that was not really an Egyptian problem, if you will, even if some fighting took over in Alexandria and in the western desert of Egypt, especially up to El Alamein. But certainly there's been fighting for the nationalization of the Suez Canal when Nasser did, I think, the right thing to take over what it was Egyptian territory, and of course the war there was swift and brutal. But there was also the wars with Israel in 1967 and 1973, which subsequent treaties of peace by President Sadat in 1981, if I'm not mistaken, and the Camp David Accords. Now, Egypt, of course, has a fascinating history, and this is why tourism is so important in its economy, but it's not the most important part. Of course, oil and gas is still pretty important, even if it's decreasing in terms of production and therefore of value, net value, proportional value for the revenues of Egypt. There is a developing high-tech and technology industry. However, as we will see, with the average IQ of 81, that cannot be developed too much. Most people will have to remain into low-skilled works, unfortunately. Now, industry has always been pretty big. In fact, Egypt has been one of the powerhouses of the, let's say, Middle East and Mediterranean throughout history. Well, first for agricultural reasons, having such a fertile valley of the Nile and delta with incredible quality and quantity of food production, but also industry in the 20th century, especially around steel, but of course around other production of products. The Suez Canal is the number one, it seems, from what I heard, revenue making Egyptian economy, for the Egyptian economy, as the increasing shipping, especially between Asia and Europe, has provided incredible amounts of cash for the government, which can then subsidize food, especially for its growing population. And this is the time bomb, the big ticking bomb of Egypt is population. About 100 million people, well, officially it's 95, but it's about 100 million people, and one more additional million every year being born, living on a tiny, tiny piece of land. Well, of course, Egypt is big, it's twice the size of France, but the place where you can actually live and grow food is very tiny. It's the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley. And in fact, the population density is over 1,000 to 100 people per square kilometer in those areas. It's similar to Bangladesh. So extremely, extremely high population density, which is going to be a huge problem because even today, government needs to subsidize food. It gives several pieces of bread per person today for free to the people, and that subvention is obviously dependent on the government having money, which means having the Suez Canal continuing to bring money in and growing, having no wars, having no internal turmoil, having tourism coming in, and having remittances from Egyptian people living, especially in the Gulf and the Arabic Peninsula. So Egyptians who live there send money to their families, which spend in the country. Therefore, all these revenues are pretty fragile. Agriculture being probably the least fragile because Egypt is a strong producer and strong exporter. But even here, it is dependent. It's not dependent on the Nile anymore. Well, yes, for water, but not for the fertilizers. It has to buy fertilizers because, of course, with the big dam, the Nasser Dam in Aswan, and the creation of the Nasser Lake, well, there is no more of this fertile soil coming down from Central Africa and fertilizing the Nile Valley. That soil is blocked by the dam. Therefore, with the electricity that the dam produces, Egyptians can pump the water from the Nile to irrigate, whereas before it was done automatically by the flood, and they can buy, with the money from the electricity, they can buy fertilizers from abroad, which is a silly solution to a problem that was created on the first place. So this is a typical example of, it's not an Egyptian problem, it's an example of mankind sometimes trying to go for technology but not really thinking through the long-term consequences. Water is a problem. More and more of the Ethiopian and Sudan and Uganda are producing agriculture for their own needs but also for export, especially to their Arabian and Chinese customers, and therefore need more and more water, and that water is not going into the Nile anymore. Therefore, the flow of the Nile is decreasing. So sure, Egypt has 10 years of reserves of water in the Nasser Lake, but controlling that water is of strategic importance and therefore could lead to conflict. Conflicts exist for water already in within Palestine and Israel, between Kashmir, India, and Pakistan, between on the Amazon basin, and everywhere there is big rivers, everywhere there are requirements for water over different countries. You do have potential conflict in the future. Now, Egypt's terrorism problem has been reduced because obviously the country is fully controlled by the army. You can see that the government's focus on the army, and actually the Egyptian president al-Sisi is a former military, just as Sadat was, just as Nasser was, just as Mubarak was before. Egypt has been a powerful military forever, since the dawn of time. It has been, the ancient Egyptian army was feared and controlled most of the Middle East, all the way to today's Turkey and almost to Iraq. During the Crusades and medieval, the Egyptian was the military strong powerhouse of the Arab world, and Egyptian armies under the Ottoman Empire with the Mamluks were fearsome, and even Napoleon, in fact, took over a few squadrons of Mamluk cavalry back to Europe, and that served with him all the way to the end, by the way. And even in the 19th and 20th century, Egypt was considered a strong army. And today, Egypt is a very powerful army, at least on paper. It used to have Soviet support, it now has American support, but also Russian support. and has material and numbers which are huge, very big number. Check the data, you will see it has a very powerful military. The army has also a lot of impact in the economy. In fact, it owns quite a lot of manufacturing plants and is doing a lot of engineering work across the country to make sure that more land is able to be used for, of course, construction, but also as more especially agriculture. So it's building canals and dams and irrigation system and devices. And it's also controlling the lands for terrorism attacks. And terrorism attacks are, of course, as is very common in the Muslim world, due to Muslim extremists. And some would say, no, it's Muslims who apply the Quran perfectly. Whatever it may be, that terrorism has decreased a lot, and therefore tourism is back quite strongly. And I encourage you to visit. It's really an amazing place to visit, Egypt. Now, the truth about Islam in Egypt is that it's more and more prevalent. In the 1950s, you see pictures of Cairo with no woman wearing an Islamic veil or scarf. Today, especially in the south, you see that in majority everywhere. And per se, it's not a problem, but what it is a symbol of is that more and more people, especially in the poor areas and especially the people who have no qualification or very little education, the following of Islam as a full-time job is prevalent. I've seen villages where maybe a village of 1,000 people with 12 mosques, and everyone from morning to night only thinks, lives, breathes Quran, and listen to Quran on TV, listen to Quran on radio, praise, of course, but also makes money to go to Mecca and do the pilgrimage, the Hajj, and when it's back, it paints that on the house. So all the life of so many people lives around religion, just like it was in the medieval Europe, for example. But certainly, it has an impact on productivity. It has an impact on education. It has an impact on the people's ability to understand complex problems of the world. And therefore it will have political problems because these people are an important part of the population, and they will require and they will vote eventually. And one can ask how much they are manipulated by Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia or other tendencies like the Muslim Brotherhood. All in all, it's doing okay. Today, Egypt is actually growing. The economy is doing fine, especially with the growth of the revenues from the Suez Canal, with all this growth from coming from the trade between Asia and Europe. However, you have to think what would happen if, for example, the worldwide economy slows down or collapses, but also if that trade goes to the new Silk Road or in the Arctic, not convoys, but the Arctic new maritime trade. So if those revenues fall down, how would the government subsidize food for 100 million people? So this is a ticking bomb. The population bomb in Egypt makes this country very dangerous and very risky. Now, some of the rich Egyptians have houses, especially in London and the United States, to move away from Egypt. And I usually advise people to think of moving back to their own countries, like for example, many Muslims in Europe should, I think, for their safety, move back to Morocco, Algeria, where they can have a very good life and today develop the economy and agriculture in places that are, I think, going to be okay. However, I cannot, by honesty, say this for Egypt. I think Egypt is going to be a disaster if and when the slowdown of the world economy comes to a collapse point. And I think that people should, of course, if you have ties in the deep south of the country, in a small village, yeah, sure, maybe you can do that. But for most people planning to move to Egypt in case of Europe's collapses or America's collapse, frankly, don't. Because it's, save your life, go elsewhere. Because Egypt is going to be a big problem. I don't know how many people live in Cairo, 20, 25 million. Where are they going to go if they can't feed themselves? If there's no food coming to them? If the government can't subsidize food production? Are they going to go to the countryside? Well, there's no countryside. It's very small land able to get people in. So it's going to be very, very difficult. So the prospects in case of economic collapse for Egypt, I think, are very dark. It's one of the countries that are going to be the most dangerous. while it's okay today. And this is the paradox: is you can feel Egypt doing okay now, whereas, for example, you can see France or UK not doing well. But in case of collapse, well, UK is not a good example. It's also going to be a disaster, but certainly Egypt will. So I would advise people who live in Egypt to be very, very careful about um, what happens in case of an economic collapse, and to really think about a plan B, maybe elsewhere, or planning something in the countryside that is really secure, with a strong family around you. So, if you want more information, I advise you, to read my book, "Survive the Economic Collapse." The first one, the first book. This book is also translated in Arabic, so you can have it in English, you can have it in French, you can have it in Arabic. I know there's a lot of Egyptians who understand and speak and read French, especially in Alexandria. All in all, I must say that it's a nice country. It's a beautiful country, and the people are very friendly, very hospitable, and I really enjoy it every time I go there for business or for travel. However, I have to be honest, it's going to be very difficult in the future, and Egypt is going to be one of the countries that will collapse the most. And I think that in that region, Saudi is probably the worst in terms of ability to sustain any form of living. However, Egypt can sustain a big form of living. When Napoleon landed in Egypt, the population was 3 million, which was huge for such a land. And I think that this is the population that Egypt will revert to. So if you make the math, that's a lot of trouble going from 100 million to 3. So think about it. Challenge this in the comments. I wish all my Egyptian friends the best, but be careful and prepare yourselves. Take care.